everyone, this is Asma, and today I'm going to be presenting on ESL in prisons. I picked this topic because I thought it would be interesting to know. We focused a lot on ESL in general, outside in schools, issues with education, with elementary schools and above, but I wanted to know more about what is actually going on behind bars. So here we go. So the main things I'm going to cover are critical statistics about prisons in general and how they're increasing and the numbers that they're in the United States. Education and ESL together. So critical statistics will lead to the importance of education and ESL in general. And then I'm going to talk about and differentiate between the federal prisons and the state prisons, both in which I'm going to talk about their policies. I'm going to talk about their regulations and programs that they provide in terms of education and specifically ESL learning. Then I'll talk about assessment and test taking in ESL in general and the challenges of second language acquisition. So let's start. First off, there's this big number over here. There's 2.19 million inmates, or we can call them adults in custody, for a better word, who are in prisons in the U.S. today. That is a huge number. So the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, right? About 25% of the world's total prison population is in the United States. So that's like, of all the prisoners in the world, 25% is in America. So of course America is huge, but that's still like a shocking number. Of the 2.19 million prisoners as of 2019, 95% will eventually leave prison. 95%. Now wait, 5% of those leave in a coffin. And this is the big question. Now, of all the ones that actually enter prison and leave, more than 650,000 ex-offenders are released from prison every year. That's a big number, right? Everyone's thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen in society? What's going to, right? 70% of them will be rearrested within a span of about 3 years. So what they call that is actually recidivism. That's like there's a high recidivism rate in the United States, in which a lot of the prisoners leave and most of them come back in. So how do we fix this problem, and what is the solution to all this, right? So education and ESL in prisons, that's what it leads to. So it's proven, or there's a statement here. Yeah, I want to start with Jennifer Lackey. She calls it the prison education paradox. She says, prisons are in some of the darkest corners of our society, and yet despite and sometimes even because of this, the brightest lights shine in these classrooms. So this is Jennifer Lackey. She is a professor of psychology at Northwestern, and she's the director of the Northwestern Prison Educational Program. So this is her teaching at Statesville Correctional Center. And she talks later, I'm going to give you some more details later about her. So these are some rates that she discussed in her website or in her program. There's 43% reduction in recidivism rates for prisoners who participate in educational programs in general. So of all those people that are leaving and coming back, once they enroll in education or study in ESL, any form of education, their rate and their chances of actually coming back to prison drops by 43%. There's lower recidivism rate as a result of educational programs, employment opportunities, cost effective for the government, less taxes for the people, fewer incarcerations and infractions, violations. It's better for the community. It's safer for the community. So there are a lot of benefits that come along with that. Now, tied into that is ESL. Now, of all the programs and educational programs that are provided across the federal and state prisons, ESL is one of the main programs that they provide. And I'll explain more how it ties in together, but it's one of the educational programs that they provide, and usually comes for two purposes. Communication purposes, because some prisoners cannot actually communicate with the officers in there, so they have to learn some English. And that's the reason why they provide the program. And the second is for correctional purposes, which ties in with the results that I just mentioned earlier, or the positive effects of education. Who are the ESL learners? You can see Espanol over here in the bottom. 31.7% of inmates held in federal facilities are classified as Hispanic. Now, 1.6% of those are Native Americans, and 1.8% are Asian. Now, this was a statistic in 2010, so it's not as accurate as of today, but still the Hispanic population is the biggest population that requires ESL learning. Now, in New Mexico, over 53% of the prisoners are require ESL learning. In New York State, there's over 32%. So it's the second largest state that has a lot of inmates who require or have low English level proficiency, and 5 other states cover over 25%. So Spanish is the most common non-English language in prison, as it is outside, of course. Now, let's talk about federal prisons and state prisons. And before I delve into that, I want to talk about the main differences between each. So, Federal Bureau of Prisons, which is called the FBP, kind of like how we say the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is Federal Bureau of Prisons. And then there is the State Department of Corrections. Now, what's the difference? Federal Bureau is obviously federal, so it's established to ensure consistent and centralized administration, whereas the State Department of Corrections is separate. Every state has its own rules, kind of how we talked about the standards in English. Each standard is applied separately in different states, so it's kind of the same thing. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the history overview and a little bit of the policies in terms of the federal government, how kind of it came about, what are the laws that enforce ESL learning in federal prisons. So it starts with the Title VI Civil Rights Act. This is in 1967. It outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, including language. So this is the basis for enforcing the language. It stems from there. In 1982 and 1986, there were literacy programs that were established, really important, kind of like the main programs that are established in educational systems across the prisons today. In 1982, it was until 6th grade, and then they adjusted it to be until 8th grade, which is what it is until today. In 1990, there's the Crime Control Act, one of the largest crime bills that was passed across the history of the United States. And one of the repercussions from that bill, some were really negative in terms of the education enforcement in prisons, but some were positive in terms of the fact that it still enforced literacy programs, and actually in some federal prisons enforced it until 12th grade, but not all of them, and it's actually rare. In 2000, there was an executive order, so this is an order directly from the president, in which they wanted to reinforce the Title VI Civil Rights Act, ensuring specifically meaningful access to limited English proficient inmates. And that helped again in enforcing programs until today. 2007, there's a Second Chance Act, which basically, as the title implies, a second chance to give more chance for inmates to readjust and readapt back into the society once they're out. And one of these programs that they provide is English language learning. 2013, there were grants that were provided by the Department of Education, which helped boost programs or ESL programs, one of the things that it did. 2018 was the First Step Act, and this act reinforced the 2007 Second Chance Act. So as presidents come by, they reinforce the same acts, but all of these policies corroborate the enforcement of ESL learning in prisons, in federal prisons. Now, there are 2 major policies that cover federal prisons. The first one is education training and leisure time programs, and then the second one is English as Second Language program. These 2 are the main policies that mandate ESL learning in federal prisons. All right. Now, when I went to the website for Federal Bureau of Prisons, that's the website updated up to 2017, they had this link, which is basically describing the ESL program in federal prisons. The program description, it functions until so inmates are supposed to learn English as second language if they require or if they need it, until the 8th grade level education in listening and reading comprehension in general. Time frame is different from prison to prison in the federal prisons, but it's Monday through Friday. Just want to give quick a recap of what they have on the website. Minimum of 1.5 hours per day. Admission for English proficient inmates are required to participate in ESL programs, so it's not a choice, it's not an option, they have to do it. And then the 2 policies that I already mentioned earlier that covers ESL programs in prisons are mentioned below. Now, let's talk about state prisons. Now, state prisons are, as it suggests, based on the state, right? So all the states, based on the 50 states that are there, have their own policies, their own regulations, and their own ESL programs that they enforce. So they're not always the same across the board. Now, State Department of Corrections, this was an interesting graph I just decided to include here because it shows all the states, the number of inmates in all the states. Starts with Alabama. There's a crazy number down there, Texas, Arizona, going all the way up to Illinois. And if we just take one of them, for example, like in Indiana, for example, there's 460. As compared to Russia, so basically all the inmates in Indiana state are equivalent to the inmates in all of Russia. So that's kind of anyway, so state policies are different from state to the other depending on state standards, regulations, funding, statistics and data, data depending on like who are the inmates that what are their needs, what are their the percentage of, for example, Hispanics or percentage of Asians who require it and need it, and that's how the policies change. Now, the programs that are provided in the state prisons, they're basically literacy programs, and they vary from, again, one state to the other. Several states provide ESL training as part of their adult basic education programming, ABEP, and each state, in some cases, they have their own facility, or they feel different pressures from the government to administer the ESL program. So if there's a lot of pressure on them, then they have good ESL programs. If not, then they kind of ignore it. So each one is different. Now, this one here was a link. Yeah, I wanted to quickly show the New York State Department of Corrections and Supervision in terms of their ESL programs. Remember how I said each state has different programs? All of these are programs that are provided in New York State, and they provide the bilingual program. So that is the system that they actually follow, right? Okay, and so as I said, they're all different, but I just chose New York as an example to show what they provide. Okay, next, assessment and test taking. So test taking basically goes from low to high. So most or half of non-native speakers consistently score below level 3. Level 2 is the average for Hispanics born in the U.S., and level 1 was the average for immigrants from Hispanic countries. Now, they have different tests that they take. So the TABE, the ABLE, different tests that they are required to take, and which they would be determined, it would determine whether they have to enroll in ESL programs or not. Issues with ESL programs. Now, what are the challenges that they actually face? What are the challenges that the prisoners face in terms of learning English as second language? There's limited opportunity to apply and practice the language behind bars. As you can imagine, we're talking about all the challenges in schools outside now, let alone what it's going to be like for prisoners, right? Limited funding, it's not always available, so it's when they administrators prioritize the money policies, it doesn't always go with ESL learning. There's interrupted learning, so that means like in prison, sometimes prisoners go and come back. And as we've taken in our course English as a new language with Professor Martha, we talked about, if you guys remember, the BICS and the CALP, and then the BICS is basically basic interpersonal communication skills. It requires around 2 to 3 years, but in prisons it requires more time because they don't have time to they don't have the opportunities to communicate more, and most prisoners actually leave before then, so that's one of the main issues. Then prisoners' lack of interest, resentment of mandatory enrollment, competition with free time. Statistics are not really accurate, so we don't really know how many ESL learners really are involved in ESL programs. So all these are challenges that really hinder what we know about ESL learning in prisons. Conclusion, we talked about the critical state of prisons, recidivism, high recidivism rates, importance of education in ESL, federal versus state prisons, and then the assessment that's involved in there, and the challenges that they all face. As a final closing statement, or as a closing that I want to put, I wanted to reiterate what was said by Jennifer Lackey. So she said prisons are in some of the darkest corners of our society, and yet despite, sometimes even because of this, the brightest lights that shine in these classrooms. So I would say that despite all of what the prisoners are, the challenges that they have to face, most of which are already issues that are caused by the society, they go into prisons and then they come back out worse than they were before. One of the things that Tori had mentioned in her YouTube video last week. So our job is to try as much as possible to facilitate learning and to help them reincorporate themselves back into the society when they're out. And one of these programs is to communicate better, to learn another language, to have better job opportunities and all that. Nelson Mandela ends his statement with, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." So, what better way to end it? These are my references. I have 2 pages because I couldn't fit them in one. Thank you very much.